This is Beyond the Weekend, a podcast of Cornerstone Church, where we dig into the things we didn't have time for on Sunday. Welcome to BTW. Welcome to this week's episode of Beyond the Weekend. I'm Mandy Fowler, Director of Spiritual Formation, and this week I'm being joined by our lead pastor, Ken Nash. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you, Mandy.
We are in week 7 of our message series, and it always seems like it's such a shock, as always, to find ourselves this far in to a good series, a really meaty, I think, just a deep series.
I'm loving this series.
Yeah, it's been really good, and it has been a lot more, I would say, labor on the message writing side, just because there is so much richness and depth there, and as we're trying to pull these characteristics of God that maybe we haven't thought of before, there's so much there, so much material that it's like actually hard to be able to cut it down to 25 minutes for the Sunday message. So that's why we have this podcast. We have these things that we didn't get a chance to talk about. Why don't you give us an idea? We talked about the characteristic of God being an artist this week. Why don't you give us a little recap of where we're at?
This was a fun one to wrestle with because we try to really come up with the answers for why God picks the people that God picks. Mm-hmm. We'll talk about that more as we go in this podcast, I'm sure. But you have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's the heroes of faith. Mm-hmm. And technically, we talked about this in the message, that it should have been, if we're going to the firstborn male, it should have been Abraham, Ishmael, and Ishmael's firstborn son. But then Abraham's wife, obviously, with Sarah, you have, it's got to be then in her bloodline with Isaac then. So then it should be technically Abraham, Isaac, and Esau. But Jacob connives and takes the birthright. And we have tried for centuries now to justify why Jacob is worthy of being in the hero of faith. And that's why, as we wrestled with this as a team, it was so fun to just come to the conclusion, what if God sees things we don't see?
Yeah.
And that is setting me free as a preacher, because the mystery actually allows for more imagination and more hope and actually more faith.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm trusting God more with not having all the clear answers about Jacob, because Jacob really is a messy man. And we'll get into that obviously as well.
Well, it kind of points to our impulse to make things really logical or practical, or, we have to have a sense, it's kind of our own instinct to make things fit.
Yes. And
so when we come to this story, really is a challenge for us, because Jacob, straight up liar, cheater, doing these things to kind of, take everything from his brother. And this is the guy that God chooses to bring about this great nation, and it can be hard for us to reconcile, but we try really hard. I have that impulse to say, like, well, we're looking for little clues in the text to be like, why did God choose this guy? And my answer to that is, Esau traded everything for a bowl of food.
He wasn't a good first choice.
Those are his two choices. God's like, this is all I got to work with here. The lesser of two dum-dums. Yeah, I don't know.
Well said. Well said.
But it is this is, I would say, maybe one of the most challenging stories in the Bible to sort of make work in terms of trying to figure out what's going on in God's mind.
Yes.
Yeah. But like you said, the realization, or the approach of God sees things that we don't see, I think is probably the best way to go here. And
that gives me so much hope for our story, because it just tells me, we've talked, God is merciful. Okay, so then if he full of mercy, that means he's full of mercy. So why wouldn't he be full of mercy for even our heroes of faith? So that gives me a lot of hope for our story today.
Right.
Obviously we can keep talking about that.
Yeah. No, there's a lot there. Well, and I mean, one of the ways that I try to fix it is, looking at later stories, trying to look for redeemable things and trying to pull in like, oh, maybe God liked this or maybe God liked that. But it's like, when you just take this story on its face, read plainly, it's hard to justify.
It is.
And as you said yesterday, like there are a lot of, we're in the company of many theologians and scholars and thinkers who feel the same way, where it's kind of like, I don't know what's going on with Jacob.
Right.
He just...
And that's again, that what good is faith if you have all your answers, so we're reading a book right now, Sin of Certainty. And if you have certainty in all things, you don't need faith.
Right.
And so therein lies the beauty of saying, God, I really need your wisdom. I need the mind of Christ. Help me discern in this. And so I'm at great peace knowing God's an artist. I don't understand a lot of artists. When I look at artwork during Art Prize, I think I have no idea what that artist was thinking. But they were inspired and their heart was alive. And then when I talk to an artist and hear their perspective, I find myself saying, wow, how did I not get that?
Right.
So there's more to the story.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way to frame it. Well, as we think about maybe some of the finer details about the story, so this whole like blessing and birthright thing, what's the difference? Why that's a little confusing. Like first, Jacob steals the birthright, and then there's a question of a blessing. Like, can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, that's extremely complicated because in Genesis 27:36, you have Esau literally saying point blank, Jacob, my brother, first took my birthright. Now he takes my blessing. It would be easy if he just said he took my birthright and Dad, you let him take my birthright. And it's all clumped into one big concept of the story of God flowing through. So there seems to be a real clear distinction in their mindset of what are these two things. Going back to the beginning of Genesis, a lot of theologians have said the idea of blessing is humans were given a general blessing from God, like all humans, go and multiply on earth, take dominion. That is a blessing to live in creation. And back to our language from week 1, partner with me is just a general blessing. But when we chose independence over and over and over again through the time of Noah, through the time of the chaos of the Tower of Babel and all the repetitive cycles of sin, you have a spirit of God saying, I need to truly rescue them from themselves because they keep choosing independence. They don't keep choosing to partner with me. So God came up with a plan of salvation. And this is where now there becomes, if you will, a secondary blessing, which is a blessing of a lineage. And it seems that when the birthright language is like all dads would have a birthright for their inheritance of their children. Their children will get this birthright. So birthright is also just a generic individual family thing. How do you distribute responsibility, inheritance throughout the family? Well, it's called the birthright. These guys were into the big plan of salvation, God's partnership connected with the unique special blessing. So it's like there's a second blessing here that's being talked about. And Isaac, for whatever reason, chooses to say, you only get this, I'm only going to give this blessing out to one person because it's like he had this desire to be in such partnership with God that he's saying, I'm going to honor God's way, that there's this way of salvation that is being created. I'm not going to give out two and potentially split this blessing in two different ways. So there is a conviction in his soul there. It's quite interesting.
That he really sticks with, despite, Esau pleading with him. Like he just decides to stick with his guns, even though it's this like crazy situation where Jacob has stolen this blessing. And even as his son is pleading with him, he still says no.
Which is interesting because you see in Jacob, he blesses all his kids.
Right.
You see even God himself blesses Ishmael and Isaac, which includes Abraham then blessing Ishmael and Isaac. So now suddenly Isaac has this really deep desire to keep it one blessing in the one lineage of God's call on our life.
Right. It almost seems like that's his doctrine, like what we would say, like, oh, this is my conviction about, X, Y, or Z. We all have different beliefs about different issues as it pertains to faith. And it's like it seems like, because he didn't get this idea from, it doesn't seem like anywhere else. We don't see that,
Nope.
like, as you said, like Jacob blesses all of his sons. And so it's a strange thing, but it seems like that was his doctrine, and he decided that's all I'm going to do. Bless this one kid.
It seems that's why today we have 27,000 denominations.
Right.
Literally.
Yes.
Because we come up with these personal convictions, this is a hill I'm going to die on, and this is my part of the story. And in some unique and messy way, that's partnership with God. I mean, you got to honor Isaac for being a man of his word, and a man trying to partner with God in a real narrow, specific way. This is his personal conviction. There's no evidence in the text why he is this way, but he does. And I like that as we study the text, we say, well, you got to honor Isaac for that. Like he's a man of his word. And that tells me why in some ways, even from the beginning here, why God maybe isn't terrified with all of our personal convictions that have splintered the church in so many different ways. Like, again, God being merciful. And so he gives all this mercy out. Maybe he's not as panicked about our personal convictions as we are.
Interesting, yeah. But at the same time, it's like, but our personal convictions can do damage to
They
other
do.
people.
They
and
do.
It's like, so
from
you
our vantage
see-
point, especially.
Yeah, and you see, yes. So when you're clinging to something like this, and this is,
How many times I've said in my own head, if I were God, I wouldn't do it that way.
Right.
And so that's proof.
Right.
I'm not merciful.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just for an example, like I have someone in my extended family who's very convinced that we're celebrating certain holidays on the wrong day, and that's like a strong conviction of his.
Yes.
And so like that, what's the outcome of it? I don't know. Like it's just sometimes we just get these things in our heads that aren't necessarily
Sabbath.
God. And like
Christine and I, when we first were dating, we went to a church on Saturday.
Oh, yeah.
And the people we were around, when I started telling them I want to be a pastor of a church that would worship on Sunday, they thought I was of the devil.
Yeah.
I mean, they were appalled that I would contribute to this abomination.
Yeah. Well, that's like one time I knew somebody a long time ago who said, who was, I think, a convert to Orthodox, but I was talking to him about, I don't know, a house church somewhere. They're like playing guitar. He said, "Oh, playing guitars is nice, but that's not really worship."
Yep.
So we're like, oh, we can't be friends anymore. But it's stuff like that we kind of get stuck in our heads, and like we see this. This is a very real situation where Esau was hurt, although we see later in Genesis that he does okay for himself. So I think it's not like he ends up in a hole somewhere, but but how hurtful,
right?
What a hurtful experience to have of your dad right before he passes away. It's just like a
truly painful.
Yeah.
That's fun to think through, and the depths and the layers of just the psychological and the counseling that would have been needed.
Oh my gosh, right? Yeah, the generational. Yeah, how did what kind of father did that make Esau? It's really interesting to think about. So this is stuff. I mean, it's good for us to remember that these are people, not just a tall tale that we.
So true.
And there's real consequences to the decisions that we make and the things that we cling to, and the way that we follow God. Yeah, that's just true of our own lives.
That's why I love the maturation of the church. I love to study church history, and at young adult, I'll be teaching in a couple of weeks, and I'm just going to go through church history with them.
Cool.
And so I'm refreshing my spirit in that.
Yeah.
And we have grown so much, and I know I get frustrated a lot with people coming up with these new ideas and fresh thoughts, and everybody trying to make a name for themselves.
Right.
And so that is really messy. But there is a spirit of progressive revelation, of knowledge, of wisdom that the Spirit of God has given us. That looking at it from this vantage point, we have so many more tools at our disposal. That even an Isaac didn't have to navigate it.
Right.
And so he dies on that hill, and he gives only this one blessing and causes a lot of chaos and struggle. But he was living by the conviction of his own heart and doing the best he could with what he had at the time. And I give that to him, and I love that God allows for the messiness of humanity and the development of growth and maturation of humanity.
Yeah.
That makes me scared though too, because to whom much is given, much is required.
That's what I was just thinking.
So we're held to a bigger account.
A high responsibility. Yeah. In my Bible class, I've been talking about that. Like we have all this access to the Bible, more so than any people ever in history.
True.
Every translation at our fingertips, all kinds of resources, maps, books, just nonstop, like endless resources. And yet we're probably the least read
yes
generation in terms of, we have so much access to it, and we'll be content with just like a verse here, a couple verses here, like a little chunk here. And so our knowledge of the whole thing is slight. So we're not doing a great job with that responsibility in this time. But what amazing opportunities God has given us and resources. So we should be making use of those. Let's talk about, so it is such a wonderful reassurance for us, as we think about our own lives and our own sort of rough edges and character flaws and, ways that we can be untruthful and, all these things that we see reflected in the pages of the Old Testament and the the people that God uses. And as we think about, God as an artist using us, one dangerous way that we can take this, or the way that maybe I've seen it play out, in our time and place, is that people can say, well, since God can and does and seems to prefer using imperfect people, then let's just throw character right out the door, see, and the way, one example for how I've seen this play out would be a pastor has a tremendous moral failing, and not just in terms of treating people terribly and, we're talking abuse. And then suddenly, they'll take 3 months off, and then they get re-platformed and kind of given back oh, they're sorry, just like David, who among us, they kind of use that as an excuse when you point to all of these messy people in scripture. What do you think's going on with that? What is God, is it God co-signing on that and saying that's okay? Or what should we conclude from God using messy people?
It's eating from the tree of independence. Mm-hmm. It's God allowing us to choose our path, mm-hmm. and it happens within the church, and that's why accountability matters so much. Mm-hmm. That's why it's so important to surround yourself with people who really can hold you accountable and not just yes people.
Right.
Because justification is everywhere. I saw it the first time I remember being shocked by it was when I was studying my first round with my master's in Kentucky. And there was a church called Church of the Patriarchs, and they believed in polygamy.
Oh my gosh!
Because the patriarch fathers, if they can have multiple wives, David had many. He had 9 wives that we know of by name. There are many more that we don't even know of. And so they say, if Jesus is the son of David, and that was their justification.
Yeah.
And they just didn't surround themselves with people that would walk in wisdom, that would hold accountable. And that's why I love what we're doing at Cornerstone, where we say, think and let think when it doesn't strike at the root of Christianity. So we allow for dialogue and for people to give feedback and to process these thoughts. And you get a collective wisdom from the Spirit of God versus we don't want these extra thoughts out here. And so if you don't have any room for discussion about it, you never get wisdom. And so then you can create a cult, and you get a very narrow-minded angle of justification for your sin.
Wow, I've never heard of that church. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and I would say, it's easy for us to point to these individual stories in the Old Testament and say, well, see, God uses him. And it's yes. And he was working towards a very specific goal of creating this people. And, the outcome of that goal was Jesus, and that's who we should be emulating, not, there are things that we can, character traits and stuff we can pull from these heroes of the Old Testament that are cool and admirable or whatever, but our ultimate person we're trying to follow is Jesus. That's
my
who we're
standard is not David or Jacob.
Yes.
My standard is Jesus.
Yes. And so, when we talk about repentance and humility and, setting aside power and, all these things, that should be who we are, the shape of our lives should look like that, not, like this old king and
Right.
like, because God what has been incredibly gracious and merciful and will continue to be. And that doesn't necessarily mean somebody gets to hang onto their platform,
Right. That's why Paul said, should we allow sin more so that grace may
Right.
abound? And he says, by no means.
Right.
And so that's why I love that we're, doing this series of more to the story, because it allows us to look at it through all the messy lens. And so as we look at the messy parts of these stories, you say, wait a minute, I don't want to be like Jacob.
Right.
There are parts of Abraham I don't want to be like. I don't want to be like David in so many ways, because all of their misbehaving led to terrible consequences.
Right.
And so the reason Jesus came was to rescue us from those terrible consequences. So to your point, our standard should be Jesus, not the patriarchs or any of these people. And say, if he did it, I can do it.
Right.
Well, if you want the same consequences.
Yes, that's a great point. Yeah, there's always going to be consequences to sin. And if somebody's out there, acting so poor, being a terrible person, like there are going to be consequences to that. Can God still use anybody? Yes. Yes. He's proven that over and over again. However, that's not our bar. Our bar isn't Jacob.
Yeah, exactly.
Our bar is Jesus. And so that's who we're striving to be like, and should be kind of reading all scripture through that lens.
Exactly. So well said.
Yeah.
One more beyond the weekend. I've got one more. By the way, the BTW. By the way, this is terribly off topic, but it's kind of on another church that we saw in Kentucky. They took the verse of greet one another with a holy kiss literally.
Oh.
So you walk into that church and you have to kiss. Everybody kisses everybody on the lips.
No.
It was horrible.
I'm such a germaphobe. I could not.
That would be
turn around and
horrible.
walk out.
I wanted to talk to that pastor, and he would say, "Why are we not growing?" I wonder.
Of all the verses to take literally, but I mean, to contrast that, sometimes we'll pick and choose and read the verses around it literally, but straight up ignore that one. So
yes, well said. Well said.
So that's interesting. Wow.
Funny.
So church for everybody, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, good stuff. We could continue to talk longer, but we'll wrap it up here. I hope you'll stick with us. We have 2 more weeks in this series with some more profound insights about who God is. And what that means for us. So I hope you'll continue to engage with the sermons, the message discussion guides, the Bible reading plan, and of course, this podcast. Thanks for joining me, Ken.
What an honor.
And we'll see you next week.